Alrighty, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, yes.
Okay, perfect. So let's just go ahead and get started. Good morning, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Abby Bullis, and I'm the project coordinator at the Winihin Jemide Series. It's actually really quite exciting to celebrate International Women's Day in this special way. I definitely believe that when people come together for a singular purpose, things happen, the world moves. So I anticipate the movements that will be born out of simultaneous conversations around the world today in celebration of International Women's Day. So by way of introduction, the Winihin Jemide Series is an organization that facilitates deep conversations and drives four main things. Research is one of the main things that we are working on right now. And from this research comes nation building, transformative thinking, and gender inclusiveness or equity. And the Winihin Jemide Series is pretty much committed to leading a charge that increases the number of women that you see in leadership positions. We have a philosophy that says the more women you see in leadership positions, the more economic growth you'll see in whatever sphere or sector these women are in. So we have been able to push our research agenda through the Winihin Jemide Series postgraduate research grant at Oxford University. And this has sort of been a really, really special thing for us, just because we do a lot with youth in succession planning, or just these efforts to pass along ideas from one generation to the next. And the research grant is one way for us to do that, to sort of push research on African politics and women and gender issues within Africa. So the research project that we did was just to highlight the number of women that you see represented in positions of government at the state and local level. And it was a pretty rigorous / tedious project, but I think we had an amazing team behind us the entire time. From the onset, we had a lot of hands on deck, and we've got two of those hands on deck today, sort of just to talk to the public about this research project and highlight some of the things that came out of the project. So we've got two wonderful individuals joining us today. We've got Dr. Cheeseman and Dr. Elsie Scott. So I am just going to give you a second to just introduce yourself and tell me about what you do, or tell the public about what you do and how you've been involved with the Winihin Jemide Series.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nick Cheeseman. I'm an associate professor in African politics at Oxford University. I also edit the journal African Affairs, and I write a weekly column for the Kenyan newspaper, The Sunday Nation. And my main involvement here has been kind of quality control, fact-checking, helping to think through the different metrics that can be used to get a handle on female political representation in Africa, and connecting some of the really good work that you guys have been doing to the academic literature and the stuff that we're doing in places like Oxford University.
Awesome. Awesome. So yeah, like you mentioned, quality control. So you've had the opportunity to dissect and analyze the research project. So can you just give me, or give us, an idea of the sort of review process that you did of the research document, and just tell us what you found, what was most interesting, or what aspects of the research would you like to highlight?
Well, on the spot checking, we tried to follow kind of established best practice, which is to make sure that you go back and check at least 10% of your data collection points. So we went and contacted well over 10%, actually closer to 20% of the people who had been involved in data collection, to double check the data to make sure it was being collected consistently across the different states of Nigeria. So we did that very thoroughly, and we feel that the data is pretty good. There are two sets of data that were collected. One is about state level positions, and one is about local government positions. And as you might expect, the state level positions, it's easier to get data on because this stuff is more high profile, it's often in the newspapers, and so it's easier to track that. People have that information more closely to hand. The local government data was harder to find, and we have more gaps in the data there. Those gaps I don't think in any way kind of undermine the analysis that's been done, but they're a very important reminder that actually, big governments like the Nigerian government are not actually keeping track of gender representation. There is no central database you can go to. The very fact that you guys needed to put the money and the funding and the time and effort into collecting this data tells us that this data is not being collected by governments. So if it wasn't for people like you, we wouldn't have this information. We wouldn't know what the spatial pattern of gender representation was. We wouldn't know if more women are being represented in government over time or not. We wouldn't be able to hold the government accountable on some of its own claims. So I think the thing that really came out for us was that this was a serious research project with some real effort being put in to collect the data, but it reminded us how difficult it can be to collect the data, and it reminded us of the need for African governments to do more to collect the data themselves on a systematic, rigorous basis.
Yeah, you definitely touched on a couple important things. I think the idea behind the research is for the Winihin Jemide series is definitely to get more women involved in government and politics. But I think that there is a dearth of information, and it's really important to begin by knowing where you are. I think having those markers and just knowing, okay, this is where we are right now, and this is how we move forward. So I think the project ended up being having sort of a double benefit, the benefit in that we now have data that we're going to publish that will be available for people who were looking for that information before and couldn't find it. So for one, it's there. And then for two, definitely to get this information to be used to sort of propel the movement of women in the direction of government and politics, and know, okay, these are the existing gaps, and this is where we need more involvement, female participation. How would you say, I mean, you gave us a little bit of an idea of what you do, the journals you write for and things, but as far as this particular project, how do you see, or what is the role of this research in the grand scheme of things, as far as the empowerment of women in government and politics, and what do you see? How do you see it really helping or propelling more involvement?
Well, I think, the first thing to say is, of course, academic researchers depend on the existence of data. Data like this is therefore very valuable. And I'm sure in the future, people will maybe even write, research papers using some of this data, because we have two different things going on in this data. It's important for people to know. One is that we're able to rank every state in Nigeria in terms of gender representation at present, but we're also able to rank them over time. So you've got two different comparisons you can do with this data. You can compare whether Nigerian states in the past were more or less representative than they are now, and you can compare within states at any one moment in time. And that's a really nice thing, because it allows us to look at progress over time, as well as which parts of the country are perhaps doing better than others. Now, one of the things that we did was we created two different ways of measuring gender representation. The first way is simply to look at the proportion of all women in all positions in the government, full stop. So you have 70 women, there are 700 positions and so on. You calculate the straight percentage. But what that doesn't tell you is whether those people are actually in positions of authority and power. Because if all of those women are rather tokenistic appointments, if they're all at a very low level of the government, you're not necessarily going to see those women able to affect change within those institutional structures. The second thing we did was to actually weight that data, not just looking at the straight percentage of women that are in government positions, but weighting that for whether or not the position they're in holds considerable authority. In other words, you weight state governor higher than a deputy governor, you weight different positions relative to the amount of power they have, and then you create a new index. And what is interesting, and you can see this across the board, the three key take-home points are: one, there are not many women in Nigerian governments, however you cut the data, right? Whatever you do to the data, there just aren't very many women. But two, the women that are there are typically in very low-level positions. So if you look at some states on the simple proportional measure, and you just say how many people are in that state, you can get quite a lot of women. You may even get 20–30% of women in government positions. That state looks fairly good. But if you then move to the institutional index, which is weighting the data on the basis of which of the positions are more important, that number disappears. because
Mm.
most of these women are actually not in the positions where they could really affect change. So there are two different things that come out of this data, which I think will be really interesting for researchers and those on policy working on gender issues. The first thing that I think comes out here and is really interesting is the point that women typically are not there. But the second is that states that are saying that they're doing well on gender representation are often presenting something that when you investigate it doesn't necessarily look quite as positive. Because when you actually investigate it, a lot of the positions that women are being appointed to or elected to are the lower level positions. It's very rare in the Nigerian context for women to take the most senior positions. And so there are two problems in a sense. The first is to get more women into politics, full stop. The second is then to make sure they move through that glass ceiling from less important to more important positions within the government.
That's really insightful. I mean, having worked on the project and just been sort of like super excited about, the number of women, it totally makes sense, because I think it's something that we don't particularly think about at the very beginning. So the move needs to be for more women, but women in weightier positions, so to speak, positions that, where they actually are decision makers and can influence these larger decisions for the nation as a whole. So, I mean, you sort of touched on this, or I mean, I guess reason would say that it's the same sort of situation, or well, we might have a similar situation in other countries. But how would you say this analysis differs from what we would find in countries that have high numbers of women in government and politics, like Rwanda or South Africa? Would you say it's a similar situation, or is there a slightly different thing going on there?
Great question. I mean, Nigeria is lagging behind a number of other countries. So countries like Rwanda and so on, and South Africa, and a couple of others are doing much better when it comes to women's representation. There are a number of reasons for that. One is that the electoral system in Nigeria makes it tough to elect women. It's much easier to ensure gender balance if you have either a proportional system of elections in which you have a party list and parties can rank candidates male, female, to ensure 50% of both get elected, and so on. If you have a first past the post system where people get elected on a constituency basis, it's really up to the people in that constituency who gets elected. And persuading and coordinating across a number of different constituencies can be very difficult. So Nigeria has structural, has cultural barriers. So if you look at the Nigerian parliament, it has significantly less gender representation, gender equality, than, for example, its counterparts in Rwanda and South Africa. The one caution I would have, though, to that is that I think it's also important to realize that even in places like Rwanda and South Africa, when you move beyond the national level, you often find that the quota that is used to ensure stronger female representation in the national parliament isn't necessarily always present when you move to local politics. So the data that we were collecting was not on the National Assembly of Nigeria, it was on state political level and local government political level. And at that level, most countries that I know, even if they do a bit better at the national level, struggle. Because particularly at those local levels where often quotas are not employed, where policymakers are not so focused, where attention is not so diverted, what you often find is that they're fairly male-dominated political systems. So my is that what we found in Nigeria may well be fairly typical of other African states. In fact, if you look at Kenya and the elections at the devolved level in Kenya, so not the national elections, but the 47 county governments that were elected in 2013, I think you would find much worse figures than what we found in Nigeria. There are many parts of Kenya where women simply were not elected apart from in the designated seats. They did not, for example, win either of the two key positions, governor or senator, and there were very few women represented to the assembly. So I think it is a major challenge, and I think it may well be the case, and we need to do more research to demonstrate this, that actually the lower down the political pyramid we go, the harder it is to actually find female political representation. So it's not the case that this is just a problem at the elite level, at the national level when it comes to the cabinet. I think this is a problem that permeates all the way down.
Well, that's I think that for us is highlights some of the issues that we're passionate about, but at the same time lets us know that this sort of research that we've done in Nigeria, there is value if it were to be replicated in other countries around Africa. So I think that is, you know, one of the things that we're definitely shooting for.
I think it would be absolutely fantastic if it was possible to do something like this in other countries, because I think that comparison is really helpful. At the minute, you know, to be honest, we simply don't have the quality of data to know whether Nigeria is an outlier or is representative of other cases, because as you were saying before, you know, a lot of governments simply don't collect this information. So for, you know, how representative is the local government in other African states of women, that data is very rarely available in an easy way. So if you could identify key countries that would be interesting and collect that kind of data so that we can start to look comparatively, I think that would be really valuable. Because one of the really interesting questions, you know, here for us is, what is it that allows women to gain stronger representation in politics? And if you've looked at, you know, most of the obvious things you might look for in terms of correlations don't really show up. Right? It's not simply related to democracy. No, Ghana is one of the most democratic countries in Africa, often said to be, has very poor levels of female representation. Rwanda is often seen to be fairly authoritarian, very good levels of female representation. So there's no correlation here between the level of democracy and the level of female political representation. But there is a really good question about what is it that allows for greater female representation. Which kinds of countries tend to have it? Which kinds of countries don't? And not just at the national level, as we were saying before, also at this more local level. And I think it would be great to invest more resources in actually, you know, collecting that data so that we can then start to actually look at countries. You know, in an ideal world, of course, we could have data on all of the countries in Africa and then an index that would actually be able to rank countries in terms of gender representation in political positions. That would be fantastic. Then you could see, you know, a whole index of from the most sort of fair representation of women, 50-50, all the way down to ones where, you know, women are very rarely present. And that would be great, because then you could really go to leaders and say, look, you know, you're behind your, you know, neighboring countries, X, Y, and Z are actually above you in the gender stakes. You need to do something to catch up, and use that kind of research then as a real tool to contact policymakers and say, oh, well, isn't it a bit embarrassing that you consider yourself to be so much more liberal and democratic than your neighbors, and yet your neighbors have much closer gender parity than you do? So I think that research and the expansion of this research can play a really important role, not just in academic research, but also shaping the policy agenda.
Yeah, you definitely sort of touched on the next question, and it was really just about or how this information and this research can translate to influencing policies. And I think a lot of times we just think the situation, it just possibly can't be that bad. I mean, I personally know this many women that hold positions of leadership, therefore we sort of apply the same reasoning and think that, okay, there's, you know, there are a bunch of women, but one of the benefits of research is really that it just highlights the truth. Like it gives us knowledge on what's really happening, and then I think it really helps us to target our efforts and just be more specific and intentional about our approach to influencing policy, which is one of the things that the Winihin Jemide Series focuses on. So the final question was really just about what you think we as an organization can do, how we can use this this information that we have gleaned to influence policy. And I think you sort of touched on it a little bit by saying, you know, by the time we have the numbers, we can tell governments, look, we're actually not doing so great. What are we going to do about it? But what else do you think we can do as an organization and sort of get support to push for more gender inclusive policies?
Well, I think, I mean, there are always two sides of good research, and one is to collect the data, which is the thing that you have been quite rightly focusing on so far. And the second, I think, is obviously the analysis. And I think we and you can do more analysis now that we have the data on looking to answer different questions. I think the other thing that we can look to and is also very important, is to pick up the experiences of some of these female politicians and to actually ask them what their experience is. Why did they get to the position they got to? How much authority did they have? To what extent were they still controlled by, in them, perhaps a sort of male-dominated political system, or did they feel there was real freedom to make decisions as they wanted? And I think getting some of those those impressions and aspirations from female political leaders across the continent, not necessarily the people we usually hear from, the high-profile people, but some of the people involved in state and local government that you've been trying to collect data on, would be really valuable, because we need to be able to put this data in context. We need to know what it feels like to be somebody operating in local government, and whether or not people feel that they are in positions for tokenistic reasons, or whether they're there with a strong legitimacy and able to make a real difference. And I think that one of the things that would be great is if, in addition to collecting the data, collect, for example, interview transcripts that could be made available online with female MPs or local government officers, etc., in different countries, so that we could actually contrast and compare the interviews and the statements and the narratives that those women have of their own time in politics. That would be a great complement to the kind of quantitative data that you've been collecting in the most recent period.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's really great. I think it's been incredibly insightful, and just giving us a chance to sort of feel the potential impact of the research. I think that's also something that will definitely sort of get us geared up for the next phase and moving forward. So thank you so much for your time. I'm going to see if we've got any questions. Questions at all. Let me just check real quick. Okay, so I do not see any questions right now. So we're gonna just go ahead and sort of conclude on this. I think this research project is something that has been really a focal point of all of the work that the Winihin Jemide Series has done, probably over the past year, and even before that. I know you heard us talk about this project a couple times, so it is exciting to finally have it done and have a document. So for the viewers, we do have that document. I'm going to make a link available. It would be the final report. And it is our desire that this project doesn't just stop here. It doesn't stop with a conversation. But I think we hope, or we are going to push for three things. The first being that we as an organization do similar research in other African countries, know where we are, so that we have an idea of what we have accomplished and how much work is left to be done. And I think this research, as we've kind of touched on throughout the interview, it makes us more conscious of our situation and what is happening at all levels of government. That even though we see a higher representation of women at the local level, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be impacting the sort of change and making, or be in the position to make the decisions that we need made. So it sort of says to me that we also need to work to strengthen things from the grassroots, so that these women have an opinion that actually does carry and it does matter. And I think most importantly, it is important to just, as we sort of touched on, make people aware and make people passionate about the issue of female representation, sort of as we are. So whether research is your thing or not, I think we are leading the charge to increase the number of people who are aware, the number of people who are interested, and who know that there is sort of a lagging on our end as far as female representation at levels of all levels of government, really. So, I mean, as I said before, when people come together and they come together for a singular purpose, the world must move. Something must happen. Change will come. So thank you so much for joining us today. Be sure to look in the information box for information on the Winihin Jemide Series and how you can follow us. Oh, I've just got one question that came in. So this is for you, Dr. Cheeseman. This is a question that just came in from Twitter. It says, who is the data most useful for? The data that you that we've gotten from the project.
I think that's a great question. To me, it's equally useful, actually, because the fact that you have this data over time and the fact that you have the data across states means to me that it's going to be very useful for academics and also for policymakers. So, for example, I edit the journal African Affairs. I can imagine somebody writing a really nice journal article evaluating this data across the different states of Nigeria and writing a really nice breakdown using that subnational variation to generate really nice comparative lessons about where and when female representation is improved. I can also imagine, as we talked about a moment ago, that if we can really build this data up so that we build in and add in other countries, policymakers using this as a way of shaping the policy agenda and getting female political representation as an issue that we can keep raising and encouraging and embarrassing leaders whose governments aren't doing enough to promote women. So to me, 50-50, at the minute it's both. I think the strength of the data from the policy point of view, will be if we can keep adding to it. Because, of course, one of the terrible things with research and data is that it goes out of date very quickly. We've got a lovely data set comes up to the present day now. In a couple of years' time, that's going to be out of date. So what we require is funders to come in and back you guys and others to collect this data again, so we stay up to date, and also to compare it across different countries, to invest to collect this in different countries, which, of course, requires data and researchers who are sensitive and understand those countries and collect that kind of information. So to me, it's both, but especially the more we build this up and the bigger this becomes, I think the more useful this is going to be for policymakers.
That's an excellent point. You mentioned that, and I can definitely think of several occasions in school when I wanted to do a project on Nigeria and I wanted to look at the number of women in a specific area, and the information just was not there. So yeah, that's an excellent point. Let's just see if we've got any more. I think one more is coming, and then we can wrap it up. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so the next question is, how do we use this data to push better women involvement within the next 4 years? So I guess that for Nigeria, that would be our next election. How do we use this data, that purpose?
I would suggest two things. The first thing is, obviously, we've got data now that shows us the states that are improving and the states that are getting worse. I think the states that are improving over time, in other words, we can see some states that have more women in positions over time. I think we need to congratulate them on that. We need to be both giving people a carrot and a stick. So we need to be well done. How can we work with you on the next step to improve further? And with them, it will be much more of a sort of positive engagement. I think where we see states that are getting worse over time, we need to perhaps go and talk to senior political figures in those states and say, look, not only are you not starting from a great position, but you're actually getting worse over time. You're significantly performing worse than some of your core other neighboring states. What is it that's going on here? Is there a real commitment to it? And so I think it will perhaps be two different things. It will be looking at states performing well and getting better, looking at states performing badly and getting worse, and having targeted messages for both of those. But if we want to move into the policy realm, we also need to then build in the kind of realism. We need to say, okay, where are the states in Nigeria that we are most likely to be listened to? Where are the places with a bit of a civil society that is likely to back a campaign? Where are the places with strong women's groups or associations that might get behind a move like this? Because Obviously, simply going and arguing with state leaders or presenting the data to state leaders on its own is not necessarily going to give them the incentive to change. But being able to build a reform coalition of different women's groups and associations and leaders who are interested in these issues is much more likely to be effective. So I think it's a combination of using the data to target states in which we really need to see intervention, but then through critically which of those states are we most likely to have a positive benefit. And if we put those two things together, then I think we can then move on and have a really effective agenda. But it requires that second step of really thinking realistically about what's possible. Otherwise, the danger is always that we spend a lot of time sending out very good messages, but to people who are close to them and are unlikely to make much of a difference. And one of the things might be about, going to states where we see some progress being made and thinking about whether or not, what are the key things we should be doing is really harnessing what we've got, our energies, our research, our data, our contacts, and working with those states to make more improvements. Is that a better option than actually going to states that are performing very badly and trying to get them to perform slightly less badly? It might be that we get better returns by working with some of those better performing states. And if we can get some of those better performing states closer to gender equity, perhaps we can then use them as kind of champions, as like models of best practice to inspire and encourage others. But I think it is very difficult. One of the things we shouldn't kind of mislead people on is the idea that, getting this kind of data necessarily means we can change people's minds or affect the policy debate. Women's, political representation is something that has been too low in places like Nigeria for a very long time. And that's because there are vested interests there. Every woman we want to promote onto a committee or a government organization will take a place that potentially could be occupied by a man. And therefore, there's a vested interest there in deferring and preventing this kind of agenda from coming to fruition. So I think we have to be sensitive to that and aware of that, and to think quite creatively about how we can use the opportunities we have, different forces on the ground, to actually build kind of reform coalitions, like I said, to really increase the pressure, because otherwise people are probably not actually going to change situation in the way that we want them to, especially in a short time frame like before the next elections.
Wow, that makes the data seem like the easy part, the research seem like the easy part.
Well, certainly there are no easy parts in this, as you know, but I definitely think that in some ways collecting the data, yes, is a little bit easier than changing the world, but it makes it's a critical first step.
Okay, great. We've got one more, and then we can round off. So the next question is, what is the value at the local level? How do women at the local level benefit from this?
So how do they benefit from female representation, or how do they actually benefit from the data that we collected?
From the data.
From the data. I think until we do something with the data, we have to be honest with ourselves and firm. Until we do something with the data, they won't necessarily benefit. There are lots of great data sets out there that people have created that they haven't necessarily done anything with. And those don't necessarily benefit people. So I think it's on us, the series and the others who've worked on it, to really make sure that this data is used in a way that does improve their position. But it doesn't necessarily. And this brings us back to the last question that we were talking about, that, in a sense, the really hard work starts now. We need to, roll down our sleeves, and to really start to think about, okay, we've got this great data, how can we actually use it in a productive and proactive way? Because all too often, different kinds of academic or policy data collection doesn't actually connect to changing real world outcomes. So I think it's a really good question. But I think, the short answer is, and it's not a happy answer, but until we go and use this data, then it won't. My hope is that, and I know your commitment is to use this data to generate new and interesting policy innovations, to put pressure on governments who previously didn't have the spotlight on them because there was no data collected on female representation, and to make it possible for local groups that want to raise these issues by giving them the data that empowers them to make the case that we need stronger female representation. And I think in all of those ways, we can connect the data and really make it important on the ground. But that requires an awful lot of work, not just by us, but from others. One of the things we need to do is make this data available, and we can make nice video casts and put it on websites and so on. But we also need people who are watching or reading the data to then think, okay, I know some people who are working in this part of the country who could really use this data. It could add to what they're doing, and share the data far and wide. The more that happens, the more the data will feed into local debates and national debates, and the more that will hopefully generate pressure for, you know, real change. And when that pressure comes, hopefully it will mean, maybe even if it's a small change, a few more women in every local government and state government in Nigeria. But those women have the potential then to act as role models, to bring further women through, to demonstrate that women can do the job just as well as men, to change attitudes, and therefore to be this building block, or the sort of, you know, the next step to a higher level of female political representation. And I do believe, I think it is true that with all of the different efforts that we're making, other donors are making, different actors on the ground are making, we will see greater levels of female political representation in the future than we do now.
That's encouraging. I think the final sentence there was sort of my my fun moment. But yes, we definitely hope that in the next couple years, I mean, with these sort of prescriptions, that we will be able to bring about change and see the progress from the beginning of the research and when the document was published to another time when we can count the numbers, and I think it'd be sort of exciting to see how the numbers have changed. All right. Well, I think that is it. Thank you so much for your time. Yes, for sure. All righty. Bye.